Recibámosle con un fuerte aplauso a Samantha. Espero que aprovechen.
Thank you. Since I have no idea what she just said, I'm going to introduce myself in a couple of minutes. But thank you very much. Come on in, have a seat. So I'm going to talk today about the framework that colleagues and I at CAST work on, which is called Universal Design for Learning, which is hopefully feels like a nice fit at a conference focused on translating mind-brain education, because it's a framework that comes out of the neurosciences and learning sciences to try to think about how to use the knowledge that we've gained there to design instruction that works for maybe a wider variety of students than often traditional curricula might work for. And we'll get into sort of the nitty-gritty of that, so I'm going to spend some time talking about the context of Universal Design for Learning, introducing the framework. But this is a workshop as opposed to the symposia, and so the emphasis is really on trying to think about how you can use this in your own work, ways that we might be able to collaborate or that you might be able to collaborate with CAST moving forward, and sort of what could you do on Monday that might come directly out of this. So I hope that we get to that, and please ask questions and share ideas as we go. I should just note that there's a PowerPoint included in the CD. It is not the same as the PowerPoint here. There are pieces of it are the same, but I thought it might be helpful to include a Spanish version, and I could only get some pieces in Spanish. So if you want these slides, just let me know afterwards, and I'm happy to share them. But hopefully the one that's in the CD is at least useful as sort of a reference, and it's got sort of pieces of the critical information. But before we get into that, I thought, so CAST, it's a little maybe more unusual than when folks come up and say, I work at University of such and such. So I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes explaining who we are and what we do, because I do hope that there might be opportunities to collaborate and work together moving forward. And I'll also just introduce myself a little bit. So I am a former high school special education teacher. I had a master's in learning disabilities. I worked mostly with students with dyslexia, both at the high school and at the college level. And then through that work, I really came up with a lot of questions about learning, and particularly my particular focus is on the role of emotions and stress in learning, particularly for these students who have experienced many years of struggle. And because of these interests and questions, I went back to school and now focus my work on this kind of research around universal design for learning, stress, emotion, stigma, stereotype, threat, this kind of thing. I won't get into a lot of that today. If you have questions, though, I'm happy to move in that direction, but I'll focus more broadly on universal design for learning. At CAST, which used to stand for, no longer, now it's just CAST, but it used to stand for the Center for Applied Special Technology. And it's a nonprofit research and development organization just outside of Boston. The history, I think, is a little bit useful just to kind of set the stage for today. CAST came out of a bunch of clinicians who are working at a children's hospital, evaluating and making instructional recommendations for students who were struggling in school for a variety of reasons, different kinds of disabilities, everything from cerebral palsy to learning disabilities to attention issues, emotional issues, all these sorts of things. So clinicians were the founders of CAST were working together and doing these really rich evaluations and getting to know these kids and their families and things. And they'd write these long reports, and they'd be, several pages long, with basically a page at the end saying, and here's what you might do in school, right? And there wasn't really much that actually could be done in school, despite all of this rich knowledge about this individual learner. They'd go back to school, and it was just frustrating because there wasn't much that that schools had the ability to do, and it felt sort of not satisfying. So this was around the time that computers started to be more and more available, and it started to become apparent that that technology could open doors and change the school structure and system in ways that previously hadn't really been possible. So the focus shifted from these evaluations and things to really designing solutions to problems for individual kids using technology. So this was everything from page turners that would turn the pages of books, right, for kids for whom that was one of the main barriers, to very early hypercard technology, where kids could, instead of writing, they could use pictures and things to make stories, and on and on. And so through that work, what's happened is that we no longer now see individual kids, but we think much more about how the design of instruction can take into account what we've learned from kids who are, quote unquote, at the margins, kids who are extreme in some dimension, and that informs how you can design so that the technology and the instruction being used works for all learners. So we'll get more into that. But at CAS now, what we do is we conduct a lot of educational research, so we're in schools all the time. We design learning tools, mostly technology and online based, not all, but quite a lot. And we do a lot of professional development and teaching to teachers. So we have this cycle of research work that we do that I just thought might be worth mentioning, because it would be wonderful to think about if we might be able to collaborate at different points in this cycle. So, and I'm sorry I can't point on both sides at once, but we start with basic and applied research. So we do work, for instance, about working memory, or about how stress works, or the presence of stigma for individuals with learning disabilities. This kind of work that's not directly instructional maybe, but is more sort of basic research, but it's always set in a school, or almost always set in a school, kind of somewhat more ecologically valid setting. And then we move from there into development and innovation. So okay, if we've learned about students experiencing stereotype threat because they have a learning disability, what can we develop? What kind of innovation can we come up with to try to address that challenge? And so we develop a lot of learning tools and technologies. And then we move into more systematic implementation with research to sort of determine effectiveness and guide continual development. Some efficacy research where it's more wide scale, and then synthesis work. And throughout all of this, we're refining and revising the Universal Design for Learning framework. So that's sort of who CAST is. And now we'll move into more about Universal Design for Learning. So it's helpful, I think, to get a sense of, very briefly and broadly, the history of the learning sciences, to sort of think about how this has kind of shaped the way that we educate students, and also how we maybe think about disability, ability, intellect. So historically, not so much anymore, but historically, the learning sciences were very focused on universal. So how are people the same? And so this would, think through sort of stages. These are Binet and PJ, ideas about a single kind of intelligence, that, how are humans sort of, what's in common? What happens across development typically and for most people? And this is really useful, and it sort of gave us, a lot of insight that wasn't previously available. But as we've moved forward, the emphasis has become more and more on not just what's in common, but also how do we differ. And as we've gotten into that, in sort of parallel, at least in the United States, and I'd love to hear more about the context where you work, but there's been a move towards having an educational system that also recognizes this diversity. And so in 1963, for instance, the introduction of the term learning disability, which actually also happened at the same time as the Civil Rights Act. So as the Civil Rights Movement sort of progressed, more and more varied learners started to be in what had previously been pretty traditional classrooms. So we had in 1975 the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, and then as that has sort of continued to evolve and be reauthorized and updated, we've also gotten into ideas about the least restrictive environment, which says that all students are in the United States must have access to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment that will be effective for them. So what this has meant is that a lot of students who previously would have been pulled out for some kind of other special instruction, or perhaps in some kind of institutional setting, are now in the general education classroom. And everyone's sort of in an inclusive model for the most part. Is that true in South America, those of you from South America? Is it also very inclusive? Yes? Okay, great. Oh, okay. So is the disagreement because we're in different places, or schools may be different? Okay. Well, schools are different. Okay, so some schools maybe are more inclusive than others. That's probably the case in the United States too, although certainly legally it's moved more towards an inclusive environment. So the result of this, which is quite fortunate from our perspective, is increased diversity of learners in the classroom, which is wonderful in so many ways, right? But it also is a major challenge. So how can we design instruction that actually supports all of these different learners when you've got students with all kinds of different abilities, all kinds of different social emotional needs, all kinds of different learning challenges and gifts, all in one classroom, which I would guess is a challenge that resonates with classroom teachers. So when you stop and think for a moment about how this problem has been addressed in built environments, so not learning environments, but built environments, stairs provide a really sort of useful starting point. So stairs are supposed to provide access, right? But for certain individuals, they pose a major challenge, right? So for people in wheelchairs, obviously, but also people pushing baby strollers, folks who are elderly, the kid on the skateboard, somebody with a hand cart loaded with boxes, right? For all these folks, stairs, which are supposed to be providing access to the building, are unintended barriers. But there are ways to remove the barriers, right? So you can put a ramp. And this allows all those people who previously were prohibited from entering the building to actually gain the access that they were seeking, right? Of course, there's still a challenge. Once they get in the building, it could be that they then can't get into the restrooms, or they can't, get to whatever particular room they need to get to, and this sort of thing. And it's not the most attractive solution. But it offers an option that lets more people get into the building. Okay? And I'll just pause to sort of highlight the fact that when you think about disability, we've moved away from talking about things as disabling to thinking about variability in the individual, and disability being a result of the interaction between the individual and the environment, right? And the environment can be designed to be much less disabling when you make sort of purposeful choices that consider the variability. So in this situation, being in a wheelchair very certainly is a disabling condition, right? You cannot get access. But here, it's a little bit less disabling. Yes, whatever condition is causing you to be in the wheelchair is still problematic, but you're at least able to gain access. And so the distinction between variability and disability can be helpful as we get into thinking more about learning. And I'll just read this for the benefit of the translator, but here's a comic that says, could you, so it's got, you can see that somebody's shoveling off and people are waiting to get in, right? And the person in the wheelchair says, could you please shovel the ramp? And the person shoveling says, all these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you. And he says, but if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in, right? So this is the sort of perfect example of what shows universal design. So the principles of universal design come out of architecture. This is from the Louvre, where not only is everyone, this has got an elevator built into stairs. Not only can everyone gain the access that is intended here, but it's beautiful and it's made simultaneously. It's not made so that there were stairs and then some ugly ramp is put on or this kind of thing. But from the beginning, the variability in users was considered so that the barriers that might usually be present in buildings are avoided. Okay, so there's an assumption here that people who will vary in the way they can access a building, and let's design from the start so that everyone can have access. Okay, so solutions that are universally designed provide options and they can be used by everyone. Another sort of favorite example of universal design when thinking about motoric or sensory access is closed captioning. So at the bottom of the screen, right? So closed captioning was very clearly designed for a very specific population, right? It was designed for individuals who can't hear what's going on the television. Do you know who the most frequent users of closed captioning are? Any guesses? ESL, that is actually, I think that they're just about tied. It's actually people in bed with a spouse who doesn't want to watch TV, right? Also bars and things like that. But here's an example of something that was designed for the margins, a very small, relatively small population, but it's used for ESL, it's used at the gym, it's used in this case where somebody's watching TV and the other one doesn't want to, all these things. So this is another example of universal design where there's a technology that was designed with a particular group that's typically at the margins in mind, but what works for that group actually turns out is beneficial for lots of other folks as well. So to come back to the challenge we're thinking about is how can you design instruction that similarly meets the needs of a diverse array of learners, okay, which is admittedly more complicated than thinking about access to buildings maybe or closed captioning kind of things. But this is where we get into move from universal design to universal design for learning. And when you think about universal design in the built environment or in architecture, you can kind of think through most of, or at least there's been enough experience now that people can think through a lot of the different ways that people might vary. So you can think about, okay, we need to have Braille on the signs, right? Because for some folks that's going to be a need. Or things at different heights, or ramps, elevators, etc. It's kind of a finite set where you can kind of move through and think, okay, here's the different ways people are going to vary, let's design for those. And what we've tried to do with universal design for learning is to think through from the neurosciences and the learning sciences, similarly, what are the different dimensions that we need to pay attention to when we're designing instruction, okay? So where is there variability that's actually like systemic and predictable so that we can design with it in mind? So universal design for learning and the brain. I'm going to go through 3 parts of the brain, 3 networks in the brain that we tend to think about as kind of capturing a lot of the variability that kind of, if you can design instruction that takes into account these 3 parts of the brain, you've sort of made it a long way towards designing instruction that's going to work for a wider array of learners. And I should just make clear that you're going to see this kind of a brain image This is a model. It's a very simplified model, but it actually holds true in quite a lot of research that these three sort of clusters or networks tend to emerge from all sorts of different perspectives in the learning sciences and neurosciences. So they're not going to be exactly accurate, and there's certainly a lot of overlap from one to the other, but as a sort of framework or heuristic or model, we find it useful. Okay? So I'm going to go through three networks. The first is the recognition network. So this is sort of in posterior, right, the back of the brain. This is where things like vision happen. This is the what of learning. So this is where we identify light, sound, taste, smell, touch. It's the kind of network, the kind of brain circuitry that allows you to pick up the phone, you hear a familiar voice, and you know who it is, right? You're able to recognize things. You can see things and easily identify them. You can, I don't know, you can probably think of different examples of things where you can identify patterns. You think about in your classroom, right? What do you ask students to do that has to do with recognizing, and particularly recognizing patterns? Well, anyone have any ideas, any examples? So, sorry? Math. What do they need to... Sequence of colors, right. They can identify the color. They can see that if it's in a particular pattern that they've learned, that there's something meaningful to that. Same thing with, I think you were saying math, right. Things go in particular order. You can recognize those. Maybe you understand what particular symbols mean. And, without sort of with automatic kind of recognition, maps, cause and effect relationships, all of these kinds of things. Okay? But remember, what we're doing here is we're thinking about how do people vary. And certainly people vary according to the recognition network. So I'm going to just show a quick example of this. And just for the benefit of the translators, oh, sorry, let me put it up here. It says, in 1998, we filmed a two-time U.S. chess champion, international grandmaster Patrick Wolf, trying the chess recall task. You'll see what the chess recall task is. Basically, they're going to show him a chessboard with pieces put out on a picture with chess pieces all scattered around, and ask him to recreate it. Okay, so you'll see what happens here. Let me make this big. It says we showed him a chess position for 5 seconds and asked him to recall it. Oh, we appear to have frozen. Oh, no, we're gone. So it says Wolf's memory was nearly perfect. His rare errors were mostly on pieces that were unimportant for what was happening in the game. Okay, my recognition network could not do that. I don't think yours could, unless we have some chess masters here. It says, now watch what happens when he tries to recall a position with all of the pieces placed on the board randomly. is not so happy with this task, I don't think. So Wolf's expertise was of little help when the pieces were placed on the board randomly. You can see he didn't do very well at all. Okay, I'm not going to go through the description. But so if we're thinking about variability in the recognition network, here's somebody who has exceptionally well-developed pattern recognition in a certain domain, right? But even that skill is limited to certain conditions, right? So when you think about the recognition network, which at times the recognition network can seem pretty basic, like if you know how to identify a color, you know how to identify a color, and that's it, right? But when it comes to things like patterns and things, background, well, and colors actually, but background knowledge has a whole lot to do with it, but also the context and the specific design of the task makes a big difference in terms of how well people are able to do. So again, if we're thinking about what we can consider in instruction, supporting the recognition network and recognizing that there are going to be students who are at various points is one starting point. Okay, so recognition network, back of the brain, is the first of the three. The second is the strategic network. So this is prefrontal cortex. Again, there's other parts involved, but we'll stick with prefrontal cortex here. This is the how of learning. So this is what lets you, so some of you maybe were in the executive function session this morning. This is a lot of what goes on to sort of plan, execute, monitor, be strategic, keep your actions sort of moving towards a goal. And in learning situations, the strategic networks are critical, right? So this would be like doing a project, taking notes, listening to me right now. You're having to really be strategic. You're having to coordinate all sorts of different things at the same time if you're taking notes. And you're using a variety of skills together. So in tandem with the recognition networks, you're able to read, you're able to write, you're able to solve problems, create compositions, do projects, all these things. Okay? So this is sort of the part of the brain that lets you put everything together strategically. And again, we're thinking about variability. We all vary in how we in our use of the strategic network, particularly depending on what goal we have. So if you think about, this is eye gaze in two different websites, right? And in both, actually, they're shopping, because it's an Amazon page and a JCPenney. I don't know if you know JCPenney, but a JCPenney page is kind of like a department store. And you can see that the way people look down the website actually varies tremendously. So on the Amazon page, it appears that this viewer, at least, sort of looked at the things at the top, but then went down and looked at particular reviews, right? On the JCPenney page, where I guess they're looking for a couch, you know, they're sort of clustered around the ones that seem maybe most promising, right? Maybe they did a little bit of scanning, but then they're focused on particular pages. So even something where these tasks are pretty similar, but how you engage the strategic network differs pretty dramatically. So again, we see there's some similarity, but also quite a lot of variability. Okay, so we've got recognition and strategic networks. The third network, which is actually where most of my work falls, is in the affective network. So this is sort of the emotional piece, and we've got it sort of drawn as if it's just in the limbic system. It actually also includes the cortex and various other parts, but traditionally we think of it as the limbic system. And this is really kind of the why of learning. This is like setting priorities. This is engagement. This is all about motivation. And this is at the sort of, we now think more and more of this as being really the driver of everything that's happening in learning. So when you think about a high school classroom, the day before the prom is going to, do you have prom? The day before a big dance, a big event, right? Are students' affective networks helping them or hurting them in the learning situation, right? And you all know this. You think about the day before vacation and you're in a kindergarten classroom. Like, you can tell that the affective networks have a whole lot to do with what's going on, totally separate from the actual skills or strategy capabilities or all of this sort of thing, right? But it also happens for you, right? All day long, like coming here, you had to think, you engaged your affective network subconsciously, but you know, whether that you were motivated to do this, why is this a high priority for you? Why did you give up doing other things to come here? All of this kind of thing. So I'm going to do a little demonstration to demonstrate the variability in the affective network. Okay, so I'm going to show you some pictures, and you're going to have to participate a little, so wake yourself up a little bit. I'm going to describe a scenario, and then I'm going to ask you, and you pretend that you're in this scenario, okay? And then I'm going to ask you how you feel, and just yell out your answer, okay? Okay, for a birthday gift, your spouse got you a skydiving lesson. You're standing on the edge of the plane. You're attached to your instructor. You're about to jump out. How do you feel? Okay. Your neighbor has a new baby. She needs to go to the doctor. She asks if you can come over and take care of this newborn for a few hours. How do you feel? Okay, this one you probably can't see, but this is a menu that's all in Portuguese, which actually I use this all the time in the US, and I didn't adjust it because I don't know. Anyway, this is a menu all in Portuguese. You're staring at this menu. The waitress is coming up, about to ask you what you want. How do you feel? Okay, you get back from this conference, and the head of your school tells you you need to give a speech about the conference, reporting back. They're going to invite parents, community members, and the faculty of your school. You're about to go up to the podium. How do you feel? Okay. It's a Sunday afternoon. You have some quiet time. It's raining. You're going to curl up with a good book. How do you feel? Okay. Doesn't matter what the book is, maybe, but the point here is that skydiving, many of you said terrified, nervous, right? But others of you were like, woohoo, right? Taking care of a baby. There was a lot of, oh my God, but there was also some, ooh, that would be pretty nice, right? So the point is that any particular activity can have all sorts of different reactions. If giving a speech, right, if I change this to, you're going to give the speech to your classroom of kids who you teach every day, that's a very different scenario from you're going to give it to a bunch of community members or to university professors or whatever like that. So when you think about the affective network, I think there's this tendency to think that certain activities or tasks are going to always be positive for all kids, and others are going to always be negative or threatening or boring for all kids. But even in this room, there was all sorts of variability to every single task that I presented, right? And some of that's understandable. Some of it's based on background knowledge. If you've raised an infant, if you've taken care of many infants, if you're a grandparent, taking care of a baby for a couple hours might be entirely enjoyable, right? But if you've never had that experience, it's terrifying, right? But if your grandmother lives next door and you know that you can call her if the baby's screaming, okay, not so terrifying, right? So the point when you're thinking about the affective network is not to sort of get in this kind of rut of assuming, oh, today we're doing something that's really fun, and it's going to be really fun for all of my students, and whereas tomorrow we have to do this thing, but it's really going to be boring or threatening or unmotivating for all my, right? Things don't work like that. Everything is variable depending on the person and their interaction with that particular activity. Okay, so when we think about the three networks, the recognition network, the strategic network, and the affective network. And we think sort of, okay, that's a reasonable way to think about how the nervous system and how our learning and behavior is organized. That leads to the ability now to think about, okay, so how could we design instruction that takes all of this into account, that recognizes that some kids are going to have certain reactions or abilities in different of the networks, and others are going to have others, and how do we take all of that into account in the same classroom? So what we've done is designed a set of principles for designing instruction that recognizes these different aspects of variability. And the first one is, because we know that learners are going to vary in the way that they recognize and interpret and take in information, we're going to, in instruction, try to provide multiple means of representing information. So multiple means of representation. We'll get into more about each of these. And we also know that they're going to differ in their ability to put together an action or an expression of their knowledge. So because their strategic network is going to vary. So let's think about how can we put in options for action and expression that get over this challenge of variability, or I should say take advantage of the variability that's present. And similarly, with the affective network, how can we provide multiple means of engaging students, motivating them? Lots of different entry points for engagement. This is on the CD, both in Spanish and in English. But this is sort of in one page, what we call the Universal Design for Learning Guidelines. And just to sort of orient you a little bit, I'm not going to go through all the way, and I know that you can't read all of the text. But what it does is, it has across the very top in the different colors, the principles that I just went through. So knowing what we know about these three networks, let's think about how to provide multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, and multiple means of engagement. And then what it does is, the top sort of layer is very sort of the basic level of access. So this is about things, for instance, for representation. It's about, I don't know if I can blow it up at all, but it's about offering different options for displaying the information, making sure that if a student is low vision, for instance, they can actually have a way to access the symbols and the information that you're putting on. Okay, so that first top layer all the way across is kind of the basic access level. And then as you go down the guidelines, it gets more and more high level. So that by the bottom is what we're sort of aiming for, which is, across the three, resourceful and knowledgeable learners, learners who are strategic and goal-directed, and those who are purposeful and motivated. So when you think about each of the sort of three networks, those are kind of the ultimate goals, is to have a learner who's able to comprehend at a high level in terms of the recognition network. They're able to express their knowledge with appropriate executive function and appropriate sort of ability to monitor and put things together coherently. And then they're also goal-directed and motivated in terms of the affective network. Okay? And I just want to pause again to remember that when we thought about the built environment, we thought about a given condition is only disabling if the environment is not designed in a way that allows that person to access whatever is intended in the environment. And the same holds true for learning environments. So this is a somewhat embarrassing, but example. This is from an online pitch detection tool. So, you know, like different pitches in music. You can go online, go to tonometric.com. It's actually a sort of research study where they're trying to learn how people hear different pitches. But you can do this test where you have to say whether the first first tone is higher or lower than, or second tone is higher or lower than the first, and it goes through several, you know, one after another after another. But then at the end, it tells you how you did compared to the 11,000 other subjects who participated. I don't know if you can see the red line with the blue triangle all the way at the edge. That's where I fall on the pitch detection spectrum. I'm in the 3rd percentile. I had no idea, by the way, that I'm so terrible at detecting pitches, but apparently I am, right? So if pitch detection were critical to school success, I would be disabled hands down, right? This would be something that would really be a challenge for me. And I would need all sorts of supports and scaffolds. I'd be in whatever, you know, remedial pitch detection classes there were, right? But because our environment is not designed that pitch detection actually matters all that much, I'm functioning pretty well, right? So this is just a highlight that, again, that it's the interaction between the individual and their skills and abilities and preferences and things, and the specific needs of the environment that determines whether something is disabling or problematic. But in the case of reading, it is absolutely highly valued across education everywhere, right? There is no doubt that reading is an important ability. And a lot of the work that we do on Universal Design for Learning focuses on reading, in part because, well, both because it's so highly valued and so necessary to success in school, but also in many cases in life and in other contexts. But also, traditionally, the materials available for reading, the materials used in reading, are appropriate really only for a small segment of the population. So when we think about the variability in recognition networks, strategic networks, and affective networks, and how people can vary across, you know, all of these dimensions, picking up a book, a paper book, and reading it requires all of those things in spades, right? To a huge degree. You have to be able to recognize what's presented, very important to recognize the symbols and the patterns. You also have to be strategic in how you both mechanically read, but also how you put the information together to understand it. And you have to be sort of motivated, engaged, pay attention, all of that. Right, so reading really puts a premium on this, and a static book can't do much to support successful reading. Okay, but this is where technology sort of comes into play, and where thinking about kids at the margins helps us to think about how we might design reading differently. So this is from a physics textbook. I know it's very small. I'm going to highlight just one part. But if you think about the recognition, you can get the gist of what it is even if you can't read it. It says reading energy transformations and the law of conservation of energy. Then it gives a little introduction. Then it goes through energy chain diagrams, and it's got different examples with arrows and things. And then at the bottom, it has a section that says the law of conservation of energy. And I want to focus particularly on this section that's the law of conservation of energy. And I want to ask, when you think about the three networks, so recognition, recognizing the patterns and the symbols and things, strategic networks, and affective networks, what barriers do you see, or what challenges do you see if a high school student is sitting down to do this physics work and they're asked to read this? Does anyone have ideas or thoughts about what barriers might they experience? You need a picture. You need a picture of this to understand it. Okay? Visual aids, right, okay. So getting information from text could be very hard. Okay? Other thoughts? Vocabulary, absolutely. So especially in science, maybe not especially, but in science, related vocabulary, right. The vocabulary needed to understand physics concepts. Conservation of energy, right. You need to understand all those words and all the words that are in there. So vocabulary, turning text into images. Interest in the subject, right. So wanting to read this, right, and which maybe doesn't look the most inviting. Maybe. Some physicists might. Who was it yesterday? The president, right? He might think this is very interesting, right? There's variability everywhere. Okay, so there's all sorts of challenges. And remember, some students, just the decoding of the words, right? Just fluently reading the words is going to be a challenge. So there's all sorts of, when we think about the three networks, there's all sorts of challenges that arise when asked to read. Okay, and we're going to get into some of the ways to think about how to avoid some of these. But I want to highlight that the barriers present and the options that you might provide to get over some of those barriers depend entirely on the learning goal. So here's an example of reading for myself, right? This is tourism information about Quito, right? So before I came, I wanted to learn about Quito. When you go to the Quito tourism website, I don't know if you can tell, but this is all in Spanish, which for me is inaccessible, right? So the recognition network, my recognition network does not work for this, right? These patterns, these symbols mean nothing to me, okay? So one thing you can do, very helpful, is there's a little thing at the top that says English. You click on it, and it all turns into English. This is great, right? But I want to highlight something. And I'm sorry, that may be too little, but the bottom right blurb says, let me come over here. Well, somebody in Spanish actually could read it, but it's something about a tourism expert about the, I don't know, what does that say? Experto en turismo cultural capacito a Quito turismo. Okay, an expert in tourism trained Quito tourism. The agency, okay.
Perdón, una cosita. Si es que necesitan hablar, alzan la mano para poder darles el micrófono para poder traducirles también. Sí, gracias.
I have no idea. Am I okay?
Yes,
okay.
You're fine.
Okay, but then when I hit English, now it says Quito, 35 years as first World Heritage Site. Okay? I knew, even though I didn't know the Spanish, I knew that these were not matching, right? So if my learning goal was just to learn about Quito and tourism, this is fine. This doesn't matter, right? Now I have access. But if my goal were to improve my Spanish, this is in no way helpful to me, and in fact, it's kind of confusing, right? And so a much better option would be to put it into Google Translate and get the actual translation, right? This is from the blurb underneath, right? But then I can actually start to learn, oh, this word turns into this word. I'm kind of learning something here, right? So depending on the learning goal, the options for making this reading accessible and appropriate for me should be different. And when we're designing instruction, the particular options to choose have to match whatever the learning goal is. So it's not just that, any sort of technology or any option is going to be appropriate. It all depends on what you're trying to teach or what the learner is trying to learn. So to come back to our example here of the law of conservation of energy, we need to know what the learning goal is to think about how would we better design this particular section of text, let's say, or this particular concept. Because without the learning goal, we don't actually know what it's supposed to do. If it's supposed to be about helping a kid learn to decode, which I'm not sure that this is what I would pick, but if that were the learning goal, we're going to pick particular options and scaffolds. But here, the learning goal was identified through one of the standards for instruction. And the particular part that the teacher was focusing on here was tracing the explanation or depiction of a complex process, phenomenon, or concept. Okay, so law of conservation of energy is a complex process or phenomenon. And the goal here is supposed to be to support the learner to use this text and the reading to work through a complex process. So I'm going to show one of the products that we've developed at CAST as a way to support the learning goals that have to do with, in this case, physics. We've used this same framework and platform for various other curricula as well, but I'm going to focus on the physics one for today. And I just want to walk through a little bit the different features, just to sort of make sure it's clear what we are. So the way this kind of a project worked, and we've done this, as I say, for various curricula, and it may be something that I can talk with you about how to approach this, or maybe collaborate on something, is we start with a curriculum that is mainly paper-based, so like the textbook page that you saw. That's, you know, kind of very well designed and a good curriculum, but where often the developers of the curriculum know that it's only working for, you know, a certain percentage of the population of students, and they feel that it's limited for students who vary on different dimensions. So we work together to think about how can we redesign it so that it's more universally designed for all students. So this is built in what's called the UDL Curriculum Toolkit. I've put the URL for this particular one. You can also, if you look up UDL Curriculum Toolkit, in Google, you'll find it, which is basically a platform that has all sorts of supports and scaffolds and features built in that you can then flexibly use to present curricula. So it's got, for instance, and maybe I can do it this way, let's see. Yeah, so over here, it's UDL Curriculum Toolkit. Feel free to email me if you don't get that. So over here on all pages is a toolbar that reads things aloud. So you can highlight, I can't actually do it here because this isn't the live link, but you can highlight any words, or the whole page if you want, and hit play, and it'll read it aloud. So if decoding the words is a barrier, we've just overcome that, okay? Because our learning goal is about physics. Our learning goal is not about decoding the words, right? So we want to get rid of the barriers that are not relevant for the goal. It's got a dictionary here. It's got a translation tool, so that translates words into Spanish. We're in a lot of schools where English is not the first language. And then it's also got highlighters where you can highlight critical information. There are also underlined words here. Those go to a glossary. I'll show a little bit more of that later, but where they're specific to the physics vocabulary, as was mentioned. So if vocabulary is a particular barrier, there's a multimedia glossary that's available. And then there's supports for executive functions. So there's supports to help you know where you are in the curriculum. You can check things off as you go and progress through. You know how much longer there is. You know how many you've completed, how much more you have to go, all of these sorts of things. Some of the curriculum we've used have used different icons up here so that you know, for instance, that you have 3 readings and 4 activities left to do, all of this kind of thing. And then there's places to take notes, places to ask questions, and various other supportive features. And you'll remember our law of conservation of energy paragraph. It's right in here. So if students open this little box, they come to a page that looks like this, that says read and respond. So this is telling them that what you're going to be doing here is both reading and then responding about the law of conservation of energy. And we've kept the text basically the same, except remember, now they can have it read aloud to them. They can translate it if they need to. And also they can access a glossary. But now there's also this video, which actually I think I will show just because it's so striking. Oh. Sorry, we're a little slow. Okay, so here we are. Read and respond, law of conservation of energy. And remember, there was concern about the visual representation and the motivation or interest, right? So this is a teacher's demonstration. Let's see if I can. And it's going to be in English. Let's see if we can. No, we can't hear it. So it says, what this demonstrates is potential and kinetic energy. And energy can't be created or destroyed, which means if I give, it can never gain more than what I give it to start. And to prove that, we trust that it can't gain any more energy. I can put this right up against my chin, and I can just let go, and I can stand here and be confident that I trust physics and never have it go higher than it when it started. Okay, and he goes on and does it several times, and students can come up and try it and all of this, right? So when you think about, well, and so think about the barriers that were initially presented by our text, and then think about the change now that we're here, right? So the various barriers that we came up with, you know, we've tried to sort of address by providing different options. And will some students just read the text just like they would in the regular textbook? Sure, and that's great, no problem, right? We don't provide any information in the optional pieces that they wouldn't get otherwise, but it turns out, first of all, text-to-speech, the read aloud, in almost every class we go in, everyone has it read aloud, whether you're a very skilled reader or not, right? And that's partly because of the engagement factor, but also some students just prefer that. They think they learn better by also hearing it, all of these sorts of things. So what was initially designed for kids for particularly, with particularly low skills in certain areas turns out to work well for all. And then we also, so that's sort of recognition we've thought about, and engagement for sure we've thought a little bit about strategic already here in terms of they're able to highlight, they're able to take notes, they're able to collect their notes, they're able to do all these different things. But also, we wanted to get around the challenge of students only having the ability to demonstrate what they know in one way, which is usually in writing, right? And in physics, it maybe is through problem sets or this kind of thing. And so what we've done is in the toolkit, we've made it so that all of the response options, all of the places where you need to respond to a question have these different options. You can type your answer, you can draw your answer, you can audio record your answer, you can take a picture and upload it, or for certain cases where it's needed, you can also fill in a table, which is helpful both in something like physics, but also it's helpful, if executive function is a challenge or organizing your responses is a challenge. Even in like an English class, you may want to have a column that says character and a column that says, setting and these sorts of things. So for every opportunity to respond, we give multiple ways to do it. Any questions about this particular curriculum or the idea of sort of thinking about barriers and options or the three networks?
Con los niños y las niñas. Ok, con los niños y las niñas que están empezando el proceso de lectoescritura ¿Cómo aplican este programa? ¿Cómo se aplica el programa?
So the question was about with kids who are just starting to read or write, how would you use this? So this is very clearly designed for high school students. If it all depends again on the learning goals. So when the goal is to actually support development of reading skills, you wouldn't, for instance, well, you may in certain cases want to have, for instance, the text-to-speech read aloud because you may want them to be able to read word by word as it's highlighted, right? And they hear what's being read. You may want to actually do that. But you also probably will want to have cases where they're decoding without that kind of support. But there you might think about what other barriers exist. So for instance, we have a project that works with, that we've done with individuals with intellectual disabilities on exactly decoding, on becoming better readers, right, more fluent readers. And there it turned out that one of the main barriers was in background knowledge. So there was, for instance, a story that's about playing hide and seek, the game hide and seek, right? And the kids didn't know what hide and seek was, which added this layer of complexity to comprehending the story that was totally unintentional. So there we included videos of kids playing hide and seek. So in addition, rather than having the lack of background knowledge be a barrier, we can provide the supports for that piece so that they can focus on the decoding and have the appropriate sort of background knowledge to be able to do it. So that kind of example, depending on what the learning goal, thinking about, okay, what are the barriers that we want to provide options and scaffolds for? Because if we scaffold and support those pieces, they can focus more on what the actual goal is. Any other sort of questions or thoughts? Okay. Yeah.
Una estrategia para cuando a los niños se les presenta la barrera en el proceso de abstracción. En el proceso de abstracción, de inferir conocimientos abstractos para ellos. En cualquier área, matemática, lenguaje, conceptos abstractos.
Okay. So you're asking about abstract concepts as opposed to something that's more concrete, I think. Yeah, okay. So I think, so again, we think about what kinds of options can we provide, and this may be somewhere where, so we've done, for instance, some work around having students create models, their own models of a concept that's otherwise very difficult to see. So one example, I was in a bunch of 6th grade classrooms earlier this year where they were trying to understand odor, smells, right? Which is maybe not abstract in the way you're, I don't know if this is what you're thinking of, but it's certainly very hard to see and to understand how the gases, and how does all that work. So what they did was they came up with models where they're drawing, because we have the drawing tool, right, where they're drawing their models, and then as they continue to learn, they're refining their models over time. So as they get new evidence, they're continually refining and changing their models and collecting data and then, adjusting them and this sort of thing. But throughout all of that, the goal was to get rid of the barriers that would otherwise be challenging to even that process, right? So they need to understand what models are. So we included videos of kids talking about what they think a model is and to helping their friends to say, when I make a model, here's what I think about, right? Because we don't want it to be that the modeling process is the challenge. We want it to be understanding smell that is the challenge, right? So I'm not sure if that quite gets at what you mean, but I think with any sort of, whether it's abstract or concrete, thinking about what might the barriers be that we want to support so that the only focus is on the goal itself. Others? Okay. So if we think about removing barriers by providing options, think about multiple means of representation. So again, this can be through sound, images, text, concept maps. You can come up with all sorts of different ideas, videos, all of this. But multiple ways for students to take in and make meaning from information. Yeah?
Buenas tardes. Al decir que tenemos...
Sorry. I should just leave it on.
Al decir que tenemos múltiples formas de llegar a una respuesta, estaríamos incluyendo esto, el uso de las inteligencias múltiples dentro de este concepto. Es algo que se puede utilizar en niños desde qué edad, o sea, desde qué edad ellos tendrían la capacidad de hacer un dibujo, de tipear un texto, o sea, desde qué edad pudiéramos utilizar esta estrategia, tomando el concepto de las inteligencias múltiples.
Great questions. So I'm going to divide that into two pieces. So the multiple intelligences piece and then the at what age piece. So we definitely benefit from the ideas of multiple intelligence, and they're very much sort of in sync. I think we don't necessarily think about sort of particular number of, they're both different sort of taxonomies, different frameworks for considering a lot of the same issues. I think the way that we've tried to approach it in terms of the different networks makes it a little clearer how to translate into then practice, because you can think about providing multiple means of representation to get at the recognition network, which certainly you can do to some extent with multiple intelligences, but it's a little bit of a harder thing. But certainly they're simpatico in a lot of ways, right? In terms of the question about age, so it may be that you don't want to have 3-year-olds typing responses, right? I don't think that that would be appropriate at all. But you can think about different ways of having them express their knowledge, and that's the goal, really, is to think about, you know, does the expression of knowledge, is it only possible by verbally, for instance, explaining something to you? And for some kids, that's totally appropriate. But might it also be possible that they could draw, or they could act something out, right? Or even that they could explain it to a friend instead of explaining it to you. So the idea really is, and it takes some creativity, but to think about at each developmental stage and for each learning goal, what are different ways that someone could express what they know? According to the age, right. Although we have seen a really cool example of a college professor who has his students do interpretive dance to show DNA, something to do with DNA, right? And it's a way of expressing knowledge that's, you know, different from the traditional way, but for some students is going to work very well. There. And then multiple means of engagement. So this, for a lot of folks, I think is the sort of maybe the trickiest of the three. But we try to think about how to provide different entry points. So sort of the first level for engagement is gaining interest, which, you know, some of you mentioned, especially in terms of the physics. So is there a way to provide different means of entering and interacting with a given concept? So for instance, one way that this happens often in math, and I think we need to understand a little bit more how to do this effectively, but having different problems that deal with different topic areas, right? So the word problems could be about baseball, or they could be about, I don't know, whatever else, right? Cooking, they could be about all sorts of different things. And sometimes that's going to be effective. I think we need to understand a little bit more whether that kind of surface level change makes a difference. But providing different kinds of entry points, allowing choice whenever possible. So we think a lot about, okay, we're big into providing options because we recognize that not one thing is going to work for everyone. But where do you put those choices? Where is flexibility appropriate, and where does everyone really need to do the same thing. But choice is very empowering. And this, again, actually varies quite a lot by age, right? So when we're in elementary schools, and actually into middle schools too, things like being able to change the color of their background or change their character in their little icon, you know, that's like hugely motivating for them, right? Which is, again, like kind of a surface example, but it's something that at least gets that initial sort of interest going, and it allows some choice. But we also do allow choice in terms of how to respond to a question, how to access the information, whether to watch the video or not, whether to click on a hint or not, all this sort of thing. And then encouraging self-sufficiency and a sense of agency. So helping kids know where they are in a set of activities and letting them know that they can move at the appropriate pace for them gives them a sense of agency and being able to control their own learning. So the emphasis is on removing barriers and providing options through multiple means of representation, action expression, and engagement. Okay, so we're going to move into hands-on time. I was going to do a break, but I don't think we have time. I'm sorry. If you want to get up and stretch, I won't be at all offended if you stand up. But I want to move into a little bit more hands-on activities. And we have a few different options of what to do, and I don't think we'll have time to do all of them. So I guess I wanted to get a sense of, I have one that's sort of very technology-based and uses an online program that's freely available, that's in Spanish, that everybody could go away and use, but that only makes sense if you have the opportunity to do that in your classroom. We could also talk through more about sort of lesson planning in general and how to think through that kind of process. And then I will make sure to talk a little bit about research questions and the opportunities to be involved in ongoing work. I don't know quite how to decide, but how many folks have computers in their classroom regularly, and for you this would be of interest to see something that's technology-based? Not so many. Okay, so I think what we're going to do is we're going to go through a little bit more about lesson planning, and then I'll demo the tool a little bit, but the slides that are on the CD walk through very step-by-step how to use the particular tool that we're going to go on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some steps of lesson planning with UDL. I'm not going to go through everything, but there are some resources at the end that you can use. But I'm going to focus, so we tend to think through goals, assessment, methods, and materials in that order. So first, what's the learning goal? And we're going to talk about creating appropriate goals. How am I going to assess that goal? Which often people think about at the end, but we have recently actually moved it up to be right after the goal because we think it's really sort of integral to instruction. What methods am I going to use for instruction, and what materials do I have? But as I said, we're not going to have the chance to get through everything today, so we're going to focus particularly on goals and materials. And if we start with the learning goal, here are a couple of goals that perhaps you could imagine in a classroom setting. So students will write a paper about the state that water takes in different places, including underground and in the atmosphere. I don't know why I ended up with so much science today. Sorry, we don't just do science, but go with me. Students will draw a picture to show how the water cycle affects climate. Okay, so those are two goals that seem, pretty reasonable for a given lesson. But the challenge here is that now, to fulfill the learning goal for either of those, students actually have to write a paper or they have to draw a picture. And that probably is not really what the instructor intended. What they want is something like students will demonstrate understanding of the different states of water, right? Or demonstrate understanding of the way the water cycle affects climate, right? My guess is in most cases, or in many cases, the writing of the paper or the drawing of a picture is a means to demonstrate that understanding, but it's not actually the thing that is supposed to be the focus of instruction. Sometimes it will be, And that's totally legitimate, right? Sometimes the instructional goal, it's actually, they need to be able to write a paper that articulates an argument, and it needs to sort of have these characteristics and things, and that's totally right. But what I just want to highlight is the importance of stopping to think about the learning goal in terms of, are there barriers built into the goal that give some students, that are going to be challenging for some students unnecessarily, when they're not really what you want them to learn. So we try to sort of pause and think about how can we create learning goals that don't unintentionally have barriers built in. Okay? And then, so that's in terms of goals. In terms of materials, we've already talked through this quite a lot, but the idea that, are there traditional materials, textbooks, for example, the materials that you might use to support understanding the water cycle, do they have special vocabulary? Do they require prior knowledge? Do they require the ability to read and understand text at a level that not all students are going to have? So, again, to find the barriers, we ask, can all students achieve the goal of the lesson with these particular materials? And if not, how can we build in options to the materials that are going to allow more students to reach the goal? And then we think through the different guidelines. And I guess I hope I mentioned that there are Spanish guidelines, also Portuguese and several other languages available online if you want them. So when we think about eliminating barriers in materials, we think about providing options like flexible text, like choices, like manipulatives, concept maps, timelines. I'm sure you have all sorts of ideas of things that you do in your particular context that get over some of the barriers that are inherent in many traditional materials. Does anyone have anything they want to add to the list? That's great. So just for the translator, so an English teacher talking about having different text types, so opinion pieces or newspaper articles, so students get the choice of what kind of text do they want to generate for their summative assessment. Great. Any other ideas?
Sometimes there's a cultural barrier also.
A cultural barrier.
Yeah, they talk about something that is not understood in the culture.
That's great. So providing different options or supports that get over that kind of a barrier. And I feel like, I'll talk about this a little at the end, but the cultural piece is one piece that we struggle with quite a lot. We're very definitely coming from a certain perspective, and we'd love to work with folks to help us think through, like, as you think through your own context and the cultural situations that you're in, helping us to revise the framework to really be a little bit broader and more